Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the philosophy of objectivism to pretty much any topic under the sun. And today we have a very interesting topic. It's the exodus of the Black community from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, a historical fact that has been taken advantage of by the current Democratic Party to label all Republicans as racist. Now, just a little recap for anybody who might have gone to public schools. The great emancipator, the man who was responsible for the freeing of the slaves, was a Republican. And for many, many decades, most Black people, in deference to the historical fact that the radical Republicans were abolitionists, were Republicans themselves. And aligned against them were the white Democrats, who were in essence segregationists and still fighting against the American ideals of equality before the law. This went on for many, many decades. And if you notice now, you're hard pressed to find a Black Republican. And if you do find a Black Republican, he's likely going to be pilloried by the press and anybody who has sympathies for the Democrats. It's a rare phenomenon to see a Black Republican. So when did this turnabout happen? When did the party of segregation, the party of slavery, become the party that 90% of the Black community has traveled to express their political feelings? We're going to unpack this pretty complex issue with my favorite co-host, James Valliant. How you doing, James?
Real good. How are you doing, sir?
Very good. So there's this exodus. You're not considered Black, according to Joe Biden, if you vote Republican. Now tell me when this turnabout happened.
It's so funny. I just have to make a comment there. A white guy who has racist backgrounds, who worked with KKK Democrats in the Senate, has the gall to tell Black people that they're not Black if they vote Republican. Okay, so leaving all of that perversity aside, let's go back and review a little bit of the history you were talking about there. The first Republican ever elected president was Mr. Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party was formed in the 1850s as a coalition of anti-slavery sub-parties, small parties. They formed a coalition, created the Republican Party, and Lincoln himself, all the anti-slavery abolitionists were congregated in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party was officially in favor of slavery all the way through this period, mind you, officially in favor of slavery. The Republicans, the mere election of Abraham Lincoln, who, mind you, had only advocated during the election stopping the expansion of slavery. He didn't say get rid of slavery in the South. He said stop expanding slavery to the new states. And for that very reason, his election caused the Civil War. It was the election of Abraham Lincoln, a man who said he would thwart slavery, that caused the South, the southern states, to secede. So it's very dramatic. And of course, they hated this man. The Democrats hated this man. So officially, they murdered him and assassinated Abraham Lincoln. So deep were their hatreds. In the wake of this, of course, the Republicans kind of took over. The Republicans were the ones who gave us the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, exclusively a Republican achievement. The Republicans gave us the 14th Amendment, exclusively a Republican achievement, equal protection. They gave the 15th Amendment, all of that. In the late 1800s, just as a side note too, the Republicans were the ones who first advocated the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Democrats officially opposed that all the way through the 1800s and into the 20th century as well. It was Democrats, it was these conservative Democrats on the courts who gave us separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson. It was the KKK excluded Republicans. The KKK excluded. Let me go further. In 1924, Blacks were forbidden from attending the Democratic National Convention. As late as 1924, Blacks could not even attend the Democratic Convention. The Democratic Party was officially racist well into the 20th century. So let's
might I also say that Wilson resegregated Washington, D.C., which the Republicans desegregated Washington, D.C. Wilson, a Democrat and a hero by most Democrats' standards, resegregated it.
Now, mind you, between the Abraham Lincoln's election as a Republican and FDR in 1932 getting elected as a Democrat, there were only 2 Democrat presidents. All the others were Republicans. That's how dominant the Republicans were in the late 1800s and early 20th century. 2 Democrat presidents, a bunch more Republicans. And the second one, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the U.S. Army, which had been desegregated before that. So it was our progressive, our first progressive Democrat, and he proud progressive, the guy who gave us income tax, the guy who gave us the Federal Reserve, the guy who got us into World War I. That progressive was the same guy who racially segregated. He was a bit, if you read his private notes too, man was a vicious racist. He segregated the U.S. Army. There was no question. The Republicans dominated the black vote at least until the 1930s. And in 1936, there was a turnaround. FDR was the first Democrat to actually get a majority of the black vote. And you ask yourself, how did that happen? Well, it was the New Deal coalition. Look, intellectuals all over the country were turning. That was the red decade. White, green and purple intellectuals of every stripe were becoming communists and socialists. It was the red decade, and it was having a huge impact on all segments of society. And so the New Deal, the saving of capitalism by all of these compromises with, that's what FDR was considered, the savior of capitalism, mind you. But here's another vicious Democrat, racist. He's the guy, I'll remind you, who interred the Japanese during World War II into, in effect, the American version of concentration camps out here in California. My 8th grade science teacher grew up in Manzanar, one of these Japanese internment camps given to you by FDR.
Yes, I think I want to repeat that for any Democrat who happens to be watching who thinks the Democrats embrace civil rights. Yes, he interred, meaning forcibly held Japanese citizens and or Japanese Americans in camps. They took their property, they took everything they had. The Japanese people could bring nothing but the clothes on their back practically, and they were interred in camps. Also, something that's little known about him is, there was a very I don't want to diverge too far from what we're doing, but there was a phenomenon called the bonus army, where soldiers marched and camped out in Washington because they weren't getting paid for their services. Now, this was quite an inconvenience. This was an eyesore for Franklin Roosevelt. So he decided to do something about these folks. And what he decided to do was incorporate them into the New Deal WPA and shipped about 1,800 of them down to Florida, Key West, where they were supposed to do some building project that was funded by the United States government. Unfortunately, they hadn't sorted out transportation issues and safety issues, and a massive hurricane went through there, which was sort of forecast by everybody, but they didn't have the time or the equipment to move those people out. And it killed about 900 to 1,000 of those men, none of which history seems to record as the responsibility of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah. The vicious racism. He kept Jewish refugees out from fleeing from Nazi-dominated Europe, too.
That's another thing.
The things that the man did were repeatedly racist and bigoted. This great hero of the left who gave us the New Deal and Social Security and all the alphabet agencies. Well, by the 30s, though, intellectuals, and certain Black intellectuals led by W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, had gotten the movement to consider more socialist, communist type arguments in contrast. Oh, I screwed up last time we talked about this, of course. Up From Slavery is the biography of Booker T. Washington. I knew that at the time, too. But in opposition to Booker T. Washington, and their opposition has been exaggerated by modern leftists much more than it actually was. They both opposed separate but equal. They both opposed Jim Crow. They both wanted educational opportunities for African Americans. It's just that Du Bois started moving in a socialist direction with the NAACP, and that was starting to bear fruit, as it was with all across America by the 1930s during the Red Decade. However, Republicans could still get a huge percentage of the African-American vote, even well into the 60s. I think it was Governor Romney of Michigan, the father of our Mitt Romney, who got over a third of the African-American vote well into the 1960s. So I think the real watershed happened in the 50s and 60s, and there we need to break it down just a little bit. The
But,
separate
before you get into that, I wanted to see if this was a true fact. During this time, the Democrats were trying to keep the Black population from voting, and so they would institute poll taxes and literacy tests, which also, of course, disenfranchised poor whites. But the main effect was to disenfranchise African Americans. Now, even though the Republicans, because of the disenfranchisement of the African American vote, were losing seats to the monopoly of the Democrats in the South,
right.
the Black population was still allowed to vote in the Republican presidential primaries, which, of course, they were excluded from in every other respect by the Democrats.
That is exactly historically correct. Separate but equal had been the thing since the 1890s, saying, oh yeah, equal protection clause doesn't, in the 14th Amendment that the Republicans gave us, doesn't really mean equality in government programs. No, you could have different government programs separated by race, so long as they were equal, which is, of course, a mythological nonsense. Well, it was when the Republican president, Dwight David Eisenhower, appointed a Republican governor of California, Earl Warren, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that things changed. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote Brown versus Board of Education quickly upon being put onto the Supreme Court by his fellow Republican Eisenhower, that eliminated that and said separate but equal is out. And now government programs have to be non-racist. And that set off the civil rights movement, really, and made it possible for the battles of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King to be successful in court. And it was, of course, President Eisenhower who used the National Guard to force Southern schools to allow the admission of Black students in the 1950s. So Republicans, even at this point, were still regarded as the more civil rights friendly party, even in the 1950s. It was, I think, John F. Kennedy who, maybe more than anyone else in the Democratic Party, turned that around. And he embraced, in the late 50s, something like the Civil Rights Act had been proposed. Someone like Lyndon Johnson, who was a powerful senator at the time, and like all Southern Democrat senators, viciously opposed it, violently opposed it. You never go over my dead body kind of thing. Kennedy embraced the concept, even though LBJ was his VP. And when Kennedy was assassinated, that gave the political impetus for LBJ, who basically caved in because of Kennedy's change in position on this matter, and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And 1964 was a watershed. More Republicans voted for the 1964 Civil Rights Act than Democrats. It was Democrats who threatened to filibuster it to prevent it from happening in the Senate. However, the leading Republican at the time, another powerful senator by the name of Barry Goldwater, who would be the presidential nominee in 1964, opposed the 64 Civil Rights Act, claiming it to be unconstitutional. And in this respect, he's correct. The 64 Civil Rights Act said that no public accommodations, hotels, restaurants, you name it, could engage in racism in terms of allowing people in. Segregation, in effect, was not only made impossible by law, but private discrimination was made unlawful for public accommodations. The justification here was nothing like the 14th Amendment, of course, which it violates in effect, right? But it was the Interstate Commerce Clause that gave us gave us affirmative action and all these federal anti-discrimination laws. And so he said the Interstate Commerce Clause doesn't apply to that. Private racism, racism's a private thing that needs to be destroyed on the free market, about which, of course, he was correct. But that perception, Goldwater's opposition to the 64 Civil Rights Act, really was a watershed, I think, in changing this. Southern blacks now getting the right to vote, and that being more and more enforced, meant that the way that the Democrats wanted to get the Black vote was by appealing to social welfare programs, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, insofar as they now started to embrace it.
But how does Goldwater's rejection of the Civil Rights Act, based on these correct ideas that it's unconstitutional, the interstate commerce doesn't apply here, how does that then get morphed into this idea that the Republicans themselves as a party, despite all of the history that came before, even despite Barry Goldwater's very specific sensibilities about why this act should be rejected, why do they get the name?
Racist. Personally, in his life, he was clearly not a racist against
Right.
blacks.
How does this turn into Republicans are racist and the mass exodus that happened in the next couple of decades from the Republican Party to the Democrat Party?
If you don't support government handouts to blacks, you must be a racist. If you allow any private racism, you must be a racist. They managed to do a giant package deal that any legal system that would even permit any private racism must itself be a racist thing. Forcing it is what they wanted to do. And if you didn't want to force it, then you were a racist. Furthermore, in the 1960s, LBJ then gave us the war on poverty. LBJ then gave us aggressive welfare programs, and he specifically made appeals to minority communities, specifically the black community. During his tenure, there were terrible race riots. For example, the Watts riots in LA, much worse violence than what we've seen of late even, was occurring in the 1960s with black militants and so forth. And he was trying to calm that down, but with what? Economic programs to help advance the blacks. And that is really, I think, what got the African American community. We are going to get help. We need help. It's a kind of a racist, patronizing notion somehow that blacks alone of any of the ethnic groups needed some kind of special help to get economically ahead in this country. A total myth and a racist-based myth. But it's sad. African Americans bought into a racist, anti-black racist myth. We need government help. And if you're opposed to this government help, you must hate black people. And that was the attitude the Democrats fostered, pounded home. The effect of communism to socialism made much deeper inroads in the 1960s and 70s in the African American community as well.
Which is understandable to me, because socialism used the fissures and paradoxes in the American ethics, the demonstrable failings of people living up to the ideals, to capitalize on that and exploit them to sow chaos. But it seems to me that I often find that, of course, malignant narcissists will project onto you the very thing that they're doing themselves. And this Southern strategy that the left sort of claims, this top-down realignment of the political spectrum from the Democrats to the Republicans was it seems like that's precisely what they were doing. I mean, when you read about the Southern strategy from the Republican side, it's really just a set of sort of coincidental circumstances that people are talking about with respect to the political dynamics. But the left literally tried to court blacks away from their political base into the Democratic base by this sort of reparations through the Great Society. What say you to that?
Definitely, again, an appeal to race and racial division, in effect, as the solution rather than integration. And that became much more dominant. But you'll notice Richard Nixon, credited with the Republican who sort of started getting the South moved over to the Republican side, he didn't appeal to racism. He was an advocate of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, for example. But you see, in the late 1960s, there was all that social unrest, feminists burning bras, college unrest on our university campuses. And because of that, traditional social values are how the Republicans appealed to the South. They didn't appeal to their old racist attitudes. They appealed to conservative, religious, moral, social values. In the wake of the 60s, and that was particularly effective in the wake of the 60s. The American middle class was sort of recoiling from the radicalism of the late 1960s, black militants, college unrest, that sort of thing. And Nixon capitalized it, called it the silent majority that he was going to get. And he was using conservative social. This was perfected by Ronald Reagan when he embraced the moral majority and religious values, because the South, of course, is very intensely religious. Southern Baptists still have a strong control over the South and the Bible Belt. And it was the repeal to religious and social values that succeeded in getting the South, which had always been in the Democrat control, over to the Republicans, but only about 50 years ago or 40 years ago did this really transpire. The truth is that blacks have been making tremendous economic gains. There was when you look from the 1940s through the 1960s, when racism was actually lifting, now legally enforced, mind you, racism was actually starting to lift in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And during that period, there were tremendous economic gains being made by African Americans. Those came to a screeching halt with LBJ's War on Poverty. Poverty advance. In fact, Americans were making unprecedented historic advancements against poverty. If you look at the graph, and of course that came to a screeching halt with the federal government declaring war on poverty. America's advancement against poverty stopped, and for the last 50 or so years, blacks, unfortunately, first had to deal with Jim Crow, legally enforced discrimination, and then almost immediately thereafter, they were put onto the plantation of the new Southern plantation the Democrats had in mind called welfare and dependency. And you need this, and you can't get ahead on your own. And that psychological mentality, as well as the economics of it. And I read any good critique of how modern welfare systems help destroy the African-American family, help drive fathers out, for example, so that single mothers could collect welfare and so forth. Welfare itself helped actively destroy the economic progress that African-Americans had been making up to that point. There's
by the way, a statistical point made by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in a paper I believe in the 60s, where he analyzes fully, a Democrat, mind you, who leaned left, was able to pinpoint the rise of social pathology in the Black community as being a direct result of the welfare state. Thomas Sowell talks about it often. He talks about general poverty declining by about 1% every year, was declining about 1% every year until the advent of the Great Society, when our war on poverty made it flatline. It just stopped, like you said. And I think the African American community was one of the greatest, most dynamic economic communities in the world at the time. Nobody came from a lower place to the heights that they were beginning to reach before plantation politics took hold of Democrats. Now, I call it that on social media. I call the Democrats that I see on social media plantation politicians. They seem to be enforcing the same kind of rule of servitude and embracing that kind of idea of master slave mentality.
Democrats have always supported racism in law in one form or another. You'll notice they're screaming bloody murder about the end of affirmative action in higher education last week. No, they want Asians, a discriminated against minority, to continue to be systematically discriminated against in a government program. So yeah, Democrats are consistently racist. They want racism to be enshrined in law. I can't think of a time when Democrats weren't in favor of some kind of racial, they've always been, let me put it this way, they've always been opponents of the 14th Amendment. Always, whether it was separate but equal, or now allegedly pro-Black, which is, of course, holding Blacks back. Thomas Sowell, now that you mention him, has demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt, and he did this more than 40 years ago, that racism is not the cause of income differentials in America. It can be proven scientifically, beyond a reasonable doubt, that racism has absolutely nothing to do with the economic differentials that we see among the races. Now, people might be shocked about that, but because of the basic truth that Thomas Sowell demonstrated more than 40 years ago is not well known. But the fact of the matter is, Anglo-Saxon domination in this country is a total myth. The highest income earners in this country are Asian groups: Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Jews.
Yeah.
Exactly. The idea that white Christians are somehow dominating in America is total myth. Anglo-Saxon Americans, for example, earn about the national average, because they're the big part of the bell curve, of course. So that you'd expect them to be, population-wise, you'd expect them to be about, well, that's what it is. It is minorities, which in fact have the highest education rates, educational performance rates, the graduate degrees, the highest income rates, per capita income rates. Asians and Jews, for example, blow out white Christians. So this whole idea of Anglo-Saxon domination, first thing we have to get out of our head.
As do African immigrants from Nigeria and also
if your grandfather came from Africa, or if your grandfather came from Jamaica, you earn the national average, even in the second and third generation. How would an employer know that your grandfather came from Jamaica or Zimbabwe as opposed to Georgia or Alabama? You see, if you're an American from the American South, African American, you earn significantly lower than the national average. If, however, your grandfather came from the West Indies or Africa, you earn about the national average. Now, how can that difference be explained? It has nothing to do with racism. It's obviously culture. It's obviously the politics and the culture that have been occurring over the last 150 years. If you don't see that, you're blind, you're ignoring it. America is a systematically anti-racist place. If you think about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I was born in 1963. For nearly all of my life, it has been illegal for private companies that have restaurants and hotels and public accommodations to be racist. It's been illegal. It's been illegal. More than that, we've had affirmative action. We're trying to help minorities. We've had all kinds of welfare programs, very counterproductive, but again, an attempt to help minorities through decade after decade after decade, and they have not resulted in a positive result for African Americans. Quite the opposite. But the government itself cannot be said to be systemically racist. In fact, the people of America can no longer be said to be fundamentally racist. A majority of voters voted for a Black president in 2 different elections here in the 21st century. South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union back in the Civil War, has a Black Republican senator. So you can win statewide office in the heart of the Confederacy, and conservatives will elect you a senator, and you'll be a senator. So the idea that some of the highest paid entertainers, athletes, how could that have ever happened in a systemically racist country? We've had multiple Blacks on the Supreme Court. Some of the finest surgeons, businessmen, lawyers in this country I've happened to have met are African Americans. Now, how could any of that even be possible in a country that's systemically racist? The idea that somehow there's some kind of built-in thing that prevents African Americans from succeeding today is just another empirically false assertion. If African Americans continue to suffer today, it is because they're trapped in inner cities where the education sucks because it's dominated by the government. They're trapped in this welfare system that actually destroys Black families. They're trapped in places where crime is still rampant, and mind you, cities that are dominated by African American politicians, like Chicago, which has just reelected another heavy lefty African American mayor. That's where the African Americans are being shot and killed every weekend there. Ordinary, innocent, in drive-by shootings, 5-year-old girls in West Chicago will be gunned down. And do Democrats much care about that? No, sir, they do not. That is where Blacks are dying, and dying in great numbers. That is where people are being held in these pockets of poverty, unable to get out because of welfare and other such policies.
Held, I might add, as you're suggesting, by the political class.
Right. And so the systemic racism that we still have that's hurting Blacks is advocated, mind you, by Democrats who are claiming to do the exact opposite. So in a sense, it's that's the form, I guess, in which systemic racism still exists. African Americans insisting on systemically racist solutions joined in by Blacks.
I mean, I think even though Du Bois didn't necessarily go all the way into suggesting political power is all they should go for. Booker T. Washington was all about self-improvement. There is that sort of, there are the camps, and Thomas Sowell, I think, addresses that very good in Black Rednecks, White Liberals, and the Politics and Economics of Race, where he talks about acquiring political power, as W.E.B. thought was probably the greatest, the best path to prosperity, actually does not correlate to any of those benefits of political power trickling down to the poorest members of this community, whereas Booker T. Washington's self-reliance does.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell has great examples of this outside the African American community. You know, when Irish immigrants came to this country, they very much relied on government too to try and get ahead. So they became sort of the cliche of the Irish cop. So if you see an old movie or or an old comedy or cartoon, oh, sure, and he's an Irish cop, and he'll have the Irish accent, and he's a cop in Boston or New York. Yes, Irish people very much were into government and using government to get ahead. But of course, Irish Americans underperformed all other Western Europeans for a long, long time. Going the route does not help you out as an ethnic group.
Yes, and we can even point to that in our own culture, where Asian Americans are underrepresented in the political sphere.
Very much so.
Are extremely economically effective, and more so than white.
So staying away from government is your best bet. Doing it on your own. First of all, doing it on your own is going to give yourself the self-esteem to break out of those old racist attitudes, which might still be affecting you. So first of all, you got to get, this is why Booker T. Washington was really right. We've got to earn our own self-esteem and prove to them that we can be just like anyone else in your society. And it is that demonstration that we need to engage in. Self-improvement, individualism. Individualism is, of course, the only real answer to racism anyway. I mean, the opposite of racism is individualism. And all of these collective type solutions are always going to be counterproductive. And they're the things that are holding African Americans back, along with these cultural, social attitudes, it seems to me.
Indeed, and objectivists are the only ones out there who have the true antidote to racism. If you want to be anti-racist, be an objectivist. You cannot be racist and be an individualist at the same time. James, I have some super chats here that I got to get to. Catherine with a $9.99 says, someone gifted her an ARC YouTube membership. She doesn't know who. Thank you, because it expired and she wanted to continue it. Could producer put up link, do not have join button, something like that. So Daniel, I hope you understood what I said there. I barely understood it. So if you're better at English than I am. Jonathan Honig with $4.99. Thanks, Jonathan. I saw you on the news yesterday. You're awesome as usual. Catherine So is now an ARC UK YouTube member. Thank you. Ashley Shrugged with $1.99. Great topic, guys. So happy to see you back, Mark. Thank you, Ashley. Great to see you listening. Jeff Bannister, $3 Canadian. Jeff, that's all. He's just giving us his support. Now, Roland Horvath, I have to agree, donated €5.99. James is on fire, as always. Love these shows with him. That's right. I love it. You're getting up on the pulpit and you're preaching reason and individualism against the horde, the huddled masses, telling them to get unhuddled and to stand up.
Unhuddled. Stand up.
Stand up. The great thing about objectivism is not only that it's a practical philosophy that's applicable to life, it's aspirational, folks. That doesn't mean you have to be in a constant state of unhappiness because you're not exactly where you want to be. It means that you are always looking up and going for the heroic values in your life and trying to improve yourself. And that's, hey, you're either improving yourself or you're going backwards or you're deteriorating. So choose that path, folks, the improvement path, because I think it's the way to go. Do you have anything else to add to this topic, James? I think we covered some interesting stuff here. I hope we inform some folks who have been abused of the notion that the Republicans are the party of racism.
Yeah, quite the opposite in that sense. I mean, the Republicans are tribalists of their own in their own mystical ways. I hope nothing here that I said is telling people that Republicans are that much better, because Republicans don't even think about overturning the 1964 Civil Rights Act anymore. They're all on board with that same kind of collectivism. And I don't see that immediately changing. Although this recent Supreme Court decision may theoretically undermine that. But the point is, I would urge people to read the work of important African-American writers. There have been several really, really good ones, whether it's Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Ann Wortham. The last three are academics, and Wortham, influenced by Ayn Rand. I would urge people to read
Jonathan McWhorter, I think, is
oh yes, thank you. There are several out there. You can by saying they're rare. They're rare, but some of them are really, really the best out there and the smartest out there. So I highly recommend the works of the late Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, and Wortham McWhorter. Oh, Dr. McWhorter for sure. There are some brilliant minds out there who know what they're talking about and who know it from an internal experience level as well. It's not just the statistics. And those people are viciously, the last comment I'd have is you can really see the continued racism in the Democratic Party in the vicious racist ways in which those people are attacked. Republican politicians or pundits are routinely attacked as Uncle Toms. Where do we still hear these vicious racist stereotype language? Well, when it's a African American who leaves the socialist plantation of the left.
I've always thought that the savior of America would be an African American man or woman, because the level of independence, intellectual independence that is required to break away from that collectivist nonsense that they're being imbued with in America today would require a giant, a spiritual giant, and such a person would never be cowed by the crap that's out there, and could actually, for the first time in over 100 years, bring back this shining great light on a hill, this Jerusalem of civilization that I think Ronald Reagan envisioned in his own speeches, but could never bring about because of the contradictions in his own philosophy. I'm hoping that some great African American will stand up for liberty and truth and make us the consistent individualist country that we were intended to be.
Amen. Well said, my brother.
Yes. Well,
if you like this programming, and if you like the kind of brilliant stuff that just came out of Mr. Pellegrino's mouth there, please do consider becoming a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. We are the only ones who get this right once more. And if you think this stuff is valuable, if you think it's important to create an international community discussing this stuff, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber. Hit like, join, share, leave comments, but definitely consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK.
Indeed. It's a shame that guys like Vaught and all these other intellectual charlatans have millions and millions of views, and they're just passing on intellectual poison. Here you get the stuff that'll feed you and make you stronger and better and more capable of dealing with the world out there, more capable of seeing the truth and acting on it. And that's what we want, folks. We want you to be better. I want to be better. I know, James, you're aspirational as well. And let's hope this show makes you feel that way. So great show today, James. Thank you as usual for joining me. I want to do it as often as possible with you. Folks, I hope you enjoyed the show, and come back and visit us anytime. We're here, and we'll be talking at you with tongues of fire, as they say. And until that time, folks, always remember to check your premises. Peace.
Be well.